Here's something most Americans don't realize. In much of the world, the cost of living actually matches what people earn. Food is affordable. Rent makes sense. Basic life doesn't feel like you're losing ground every month. And this isn't because those countries are cheap. It's because their income inequality is low. The U.S., not so much. And that gap between earnings and basic survival is what eventually pushed us out. So let's talk about something that gets thrown around a lot without much real discussion: income inequality. Economists measure it using the Gini Index, or the Gini coefficient, which is based on something called the Lorenz curve. You line people up from poorest to richest and ask, how much of the total income does the bottom 10% have? What about the bottom 50%? If everyone earned the same, you'd get a perfectly straight line. But in the real world, income is uneven, so the curve bends. The more it bends, the more unequal the society. And as you're looking at this curve, imagine real people behind those lines. The folks working 2 jobs. The parents choosing which bill not to pay this month. The Lorenz curve just turns all of that invisible stress into a picture. And the Gini Index measures how deeply that curve bends. Countries with lower Gini scores tend to have stronger social safety nets, more affordable basics, less poverty, stronger middle classes, higher social trust. And countries with higher Gini scores tend to have a shrinking middle class, pressure on working families, high living costs, weak public services, polarization, and instability. It's not political, it's math. The bigger the gap between the top and the bottom, the harder daily life becomes. If this topic hits close to home, stick around. Later in the video, I'll talk about the approach we used to get out and the resource we built for people who are thinking about doing the same. But if this is starting to feel a little abstract, think of it this way. In lower inequality countries, the average person can afford the basics without having to do financial gymnastics. In higher inequality places, even a modest life starts to feel like you're walking up a down escalator. And the US Gini Index is high, very high. The Nordic countries are around 25 to 30. Western Europe, around 30 to 34. Canada, Australia, and Japan, around 32 to 34. While the United States is around 41 to 43. Context, Latin America and South Africa are anywhere from 45 to over 60. So the U.S. sits closer to Brazil and Mexico than to Germany or France in terms of income inequality. The U.S. isn't especially expensive because it's rich. It's expensive because the gap between the high earners and everyone else is huge. This isn't just something economists argue about. You feel this when the price of rent jumps again, but your paycheck doesn't. You feel it when the grocery bill hits triple digits for the same 5 items you always buy. So why has the Gini Index gotten so high? Well, for 40 years, wages stagnated, housing prices exploded, healthcare became the most expensive on earth, childcare doubled and tripled, student debt skyrocketed, CEO pay detached from worker pay, unions collapsed, and public services weakened. Basically, the cost of being alive kept going up while incomes didn't. If you've ever looked at your Social Security estimate and felt your stomach drop, I can relate. I've been working since I was 14. I've done everything right, paid into the system for decades, and the estimate of what I'll get at 67 will barely cover groceries by then. That was a hard pill to swallow, and it forced me to rethink the entire plan for the rest of my life. See, I realized a number of years ago that I'd probably never be able to retire. I have no pension and no retirement savings other than a small 401k, which would just last months back home. At the moment, retirement still doesn't look very likely. But at least now there's a glimmer of hope, thanks to a dramatically lower cost of living. The moment I took my first international trip with Wendy back in 2019, I immediately started considering what it would be like to live outside the U.S. I started traveling abroad much later in life than Wendy because I'd always thought being rich was a prerequisite. So it's a little ironic that for 6 years, I carried on about moving to whatever country we were in at any given time, while Wendy uncharacteristically resisted. Our cost of living was becoming less manageable, while the political divide was becoming more onerous. We wanted a better quality of life. We wanted what we saw on the expat life channels. Anyone who's watched this niche with a critical eye knows a lot of it is curated, sometimes disingenuous, an illusion peddled by trust fund kids and folks living off dividends. And hey, good for them. It'd just be nice if they didn't play act living on a shoestring. And now that our content has reached a slightly larger audience, it's been weird to learn that some people think we're in that group. So one goal of this video is to give some insight into why we left in hopes of establishing our credibility and our sincerity. When I'd bring up my pipe dreams of moving to Dominica or New Zealand, Wendy would inwardly roll her eyes, but outwardly she'd play along, even though she didn't believe it was possible. Eventually, she started seeing the writing on the wall too. So she started digging, and kept digging for months. After a year, she had an epiphany. We had to get creative. She analyzed our finances, our savings, our online prospects. In October of 2024, she approached me with an announcement, which basically came down to a detailed plan followed by a proposition. If we follow these steps, we can be out of here by this time next year. I was on board immediately. I trusted Wendy implicitly because she had established her bona fides. By then, we'd traveled to 9 countries on 3 continents, with strict timelines and tight finances. Each trip was scheduled, booked, and budgeted by Wendy. I planned the fun stuff, like which dive shops to use. So at this point, we were 90% sure that we were going to Albania, but we kept options open and contingencies in place. The best laid plans of mice and men. In January 2025, during a 3-week trip to Sao Tome and Principe with stops in Portugal and Spain, a trip that took a year to plan and save for, my boss fired me. Via email, 3 days before we got home. Classy. Ironically, I had been agonizing over how to tell her I'd be leaving. Should I give notice early and risk losing income? Should I give 2 weeks' notice or no notice at all? I lost more sleep over it than I like to admit. But she had no such dilemma, and neither will yours if it comes down to it. So my advice, give only as much notice as you can afford to lose income for. And if that means telling them after you're gone, so be it. Upon reading that email, everything was flipped on its head. We no longer had 10 months. Panic ensued. But we regrouped, altered the plan, and moved forward. We shifted our departure date from October to June, until we realized airfare was double and short-term rentals were nearly triple during tourist season. So June became the end of March. This was a dark time. When one of us felt defeated, the other carried the emotional load. We encouraged one another and found humor where we could. For me, the seething fury of losing my job was a powerful motivator. Once the airfare was paid for, the gravity hit. Buying one-way tickets feels alien. We got rid of almost everything, wrapped up our lives, and on March 30th, we flew out, landing in Albania on April 1st. What was supposed to take 10 months we accomplished in 10 weeks. We call ourselves economic refugees because, unlike many people who move abroad, we didn't leave by choice. We didn't have a house to sell or investments to live off. The money I raised selling my stuff was just enough for my share of one tight year in Škoda while working 7 days a week to build our online business. We're not retired, and we're not on vacation. So when I see comments like, "So you left a pricey state and chose to leave the country rather than go to another state," I honestly don't know where that person is coming from. The presumption that anywhere in America is automatically preferable to the rest of the world doesn't compute for me. Most of us grew up expecting that hard work would keep us afloat. But for a lot of people, it feels like the math just doesn't work anymore, no matter how much they grind. Wendy and I have seen this within our lifetimes, and according to our channel analytics, so have most of you. So while the problem is especially acute in areas like Santa Cruz, where we came from, it's happening at different rates nationwide. If your town isn't feeling it yet, that's often just a lag, kind of like watching a wave form out at sea before it finally crashes into shore. And if there's a character trait that has become all too common in America in the past 40 years, those at the top will not hesitate to pull up the ladder at the slightest provocation. Having an exit strategy could seriously make all the difference in the world if you're someone who isn't already set financially. The data tells us that most of you aren't, and the fact that you're watching this video suggests that none of you are. In a Harris poll from February of this year, only 21% of respondents said they have achieved retirement and financial security. It's worth mentioning that 56.5% of those people were boomers and Gen X. And if you're looking at these numbers and thinking, yeah, that tracks, you're not alone. When huge swaths of the country are either unsure about retirement or convinced it's impossible, that's not a personal failure. That's a system problem. Albania's Gini number typically sits around 32 to 34, which is right in line with many European countries. In practical terms, that means incomes tend to be more balanced. Basic costs track more closely with local earnings, and the average person isn't being squeezed quite as hard between the essentials and their paycheck. There's still inequality. Every country has that, but the gap is noticeably smaller. So when we say that money goes a lot further in Albania, even if you're earning less than you were in the States, the math backs us up. That is exactly what lower inequality looks like in daily life. And that leads us into another topic that keeps popping up in the comments. This idea that because salaries in Albania are lower, the lower prices don't count, or they somehow get canceled out. But that's not how inequality works. The U.S. Gini Index is about 10 points higher. That wider gap means prices for everyday goods hit people very differently depending on where they fall on the income ladder. In Albania, the fundamentals tend to stay proportionate for more of the population, which is why the dollars you do have tend to feel more effective. Put another way, the average Albanian isn't surviving because things are cheap. They're surviving because the prices fit the paychecks. In the U.S., those two things divorced a long time ago. One of the clearest consequences of that gap in America is food insecurity. That's where programs like SNAP step in. By the time we left, we both would have qualified for benefits. That's how quickly costs were outpacing our incomes. And we're not alone in that. A lot of people hit the point where the grocery bill suddenly becomes the thing that keeps them up at night. Now, I know mentioning these programs is like dropping Mentos into a bottle of Diet Coke. The reactions are instant. But most of that reaction comes from misunderstandings about who these programs are for and why they exist. A persistent myth is that SNAP is mainly for lazy people. The reality? About 12% of Americans, that's over 40 million people, use SNAP. 79% of SNAP households include a child, senior, or a disabled person. And over 15 million working people live in SNAP-reliant households. SNAP isn't free money. It's a restricted-use grocery benefit. No hot meals, no prepared foods, no non-food items. And SNAP actually stimulates the economy. Every dollar spent generates roughly $1.50 to $1.80 in economic activity because the money circulates immediately, supporting farmers, grocery stores, truck drivers, distributors, and local communities. So when people say, my taxes are feeding someone else, the truth is that dollar is actually feeding your local economy. It's not a handout. It's a stabilizer. And these aren't people living lavish lifestyles. These are your coworkers, your neighbors, the person bagging your groceries, the family sitting next to you at the clinic. Nobody is getting rich on $6 a day in groceries. And for a lot of families, SNAP isn't even about food. It's about freeing up just enough cash to afford an inhaler, or to pay for a kid's field trip, or maybe keep the lights on that month. We're also talking about active duty military, veterans, and retail and warehouse employees at companies that are household names and which carefully cultivate family-first reputations. If you've never had to use SNAP, it's easy to imagine it as some giant subsidy. But when you're actually standing in the checkout line, comparing labels, making sure what you picked is eligible, the experience is far from luxurious. When you zoom out, you start to see the bigger picture. Countries with lower income inequality, like Albania, don't need programs on this scale because daily life aligns with what people earn. In the U.S., inequality is so high that massive support systems are required just to keep people fed. We haven't looked back, and we have no regrets. But that doesn't mean we relish it either. We love our country, and we love California. Leaving our kids was incredibly difficult, whether they're grown or not. It's greed that pushed us out. And frankly, we resent it. Greed from landlords, greed from the university, greed from newcomers and NIMBYs, greed from Airbnb, from employers, politicians, and corporations. And Americans in every state are feeling it. Costs are rising across the board. Let's go back to the Harris poll I mentioned earlier. 86% of Americans considering a move abroad say that a more affordable cost of living is the most important factor in their decision. Nearly half, 44%, say they have seriously considered retiring abroad, with 14% indicating that they're actively planning to move within 2 years. For a lot of people, the idea of leaving feels extreme until staying starts to feel more extreme. So let me ask, what's stopping you? We're here to tell you you can do it. It is a huge decision and not to be taken lightly, but you also don't need to plan it out for years and years. And it doesn't matter how old you are. We get questions in the comments, via email, or see them in online forums that focus on things like whether the locals speak English. How does the infrastructure compare to large U.S. cities? Are there stray animals or cigarette smokers? What about vegan restaurants or gluten-free bakeries? Now, look, we're not saying those things don't matter. We're saying that if they're at the top of your list, you might want to reorder your priorities. Just like wherever you're living now, there will always be aspects you won't like. It's important to keep in mind that you're going to a different country. Things there will be different. And honestly, part of the fun is learning those differences. Some old things you'll miss, some new things you'll love, and some things you didn't know you needed until you got there. You can't take America with you, so you may need to recalibrate your expectations. And this isn't about talking anyone into leaving. It's just a wider view. If life is firing on all cylinders for you in the US, that's awesome. This video isn't for you. It's for folks like us who recognize that costs are outpacing income and are searching for options. So if you're thinking about it, let's talk about what's actually possible. Here's something else a lot of Americans aren't aware of. In many countries, you can just show up. No paperwork ahead of time, no visa applications, no interviews. You land, they stamp your passport, and you're good for a set number of days or months. The last time we talked about this, some folks misunderstood what we were saying, so I'll try and be as clear as possible this time. What we're talking about here are tourist stays without a visa, visa exemptions, and in a few cases, e-visas that are very easy to get. We're not talking about retirement visas, digital nomad visas, golden visas, etc. That's a different video. So starting in Europe, a couple of countries offer longer stays right off the bat. The United Kingdom, Americans can stay up to 6 months as a visitor. Armenia, also 6 months. Albania and Georgia, Americans can stay for up to 1 full year without applying for anything in advance. Also in Europe, you have the 27 countries of the Schengen Agreement, which is basically Europe's version of a one-border agreement. They merge their borders for travel purposes. For Americans, that means you can spend up to 90 days within the whole Schengen area, within a 180-day period. That's not 90 days per country. And those days accumulate across all of them. So after you hit 90, you've got to be out until the 180-day clock resets. Heading over to the Americas, things vary quite a bit from country to country, but many places are surprisingly generous. Panama, up to 6 months for U.S. visitors. Costa Rica, also 6 months. Nicaragua, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador fall under the CA4 regional agreement, which gives Americans 30 days to move around the region without extra paperwork. Southeast Asia is one of the most flexible regions overall, but each country has its own take. In Cambodia, it's a 30-day visa on arrival. Thailand, 60 days for U.S. visitors, often extendable. Vietnam is 90 days on an e-visa, and Malaysia is 90 days visa-free. There are plenty more, but these are the countries most people ask about and the ones most friendly to slow travelers and digital nomads. And this is where the quality of life conversation really comes full circle. When you can move through the world more freely, stay longer, and actually afford to live in the places you're visiting, it changes how you think about home. These regions are great starting points, especially if you're on a short timeline. Regardless of your timeline, we invite you to consider our online course, Pack Up and Bounce. It's a step-by-step roadmap for anyone planning to move abroad, whether you have 10 months or 10 weeks like we did. We don't just give theory. We go into specifics on establishing priorities, setting a deadline, financial strategies, decision frameworks, how to choose a country, how to prepare legally, financially, and emotionally, and more. We built the course we wished existed when we were drowning in research and panic. If you're serious, or even just freedom curious, this is the clearest path we know. Link is in the description. And if you're not ready yet, no pressure. Stick around, learn at your own pace, and let these videos plant seeds. When you're ready to build your own version of a calmer, more affordable life, we'll be right here to help you take the next step. Thanks as always for watching. See you in the next one.